Hey everyone, and welcome back to Afrodo Reviews. And on this channel, I help you decide: is that book worth reading over a second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? That's what we're here to decide. Mwah. Today's book is Halo, First Strike, written by Eric Nylund, I think that's how you say his name anyways, who penned the first Halo novel, Halo, Fall of Reach. Halo, First Strike was published on December 2nd, 2003, and is the third Halo novel, rounding out the first Halo trilogy. This book was initially published to serve as a bridge between the first game, Halo Combat Evolved, and Halo 2, which would be released a year later on November 8th, 2004. Nylund said in an interview that he wrote the book within 16 weeks, which was a much longer deadline than the 7 weeks he had to complete the original first Fall of Reach novel. However, he found writing this much more difficult, since this time he had more characters, events, and timelines to keep up with, likening it to trying to thread 3 needles at the same time with a single hand. However, he also said that he read several military combat novels and then biographies of several soldiers to prepare himself better to write this book, while in an effort to improve on the various criticisms that he received when it came to his first book. And apparently that dedication did pay off for him. It was well received by critics and actually made it onto the New York Times bestseller list. While doing this channel has quickly taught me that being on the New York Times bestseller list means absolutely nothing in terms of actual quality. Actually, more times than not, it seems to be an indication of terrible quality. It is pleasant to have an expanded lore book for a video game show up on one of those lists. It was nice to see that it broke through that barrier. With that being said, here's your ratings card, or report card. And then we move on to the cover. Now, I have the original cover for this book, unlike the last 2 books I read on this channel where I had the updated cover for the definitive editions. However, I will still praise this one, I'll be honest, and say that it's pretty good aesthetically. It's actually an art piece rather than in-game models posed about. Considering at this time the Spartan had yet to truly separate themselves with more customized armor pieces, I do like the fact that the Spartan on the front could be anyone from the Master Chief John 117 himself to Kelly or Fred, the other 2 Spartans who receive a fair amount of the focus on this book. I mean, for all I know, that could be Anton, Grace, Lee, Vin, who knows? As well as it's also trying to be faithful to the first game's style. I will criticize it slightly, though, is that the cover doesn't really have much to do with the actual story of the book. At no point do I remember any of the Spartans actually using this plasma rifle. The 2 Marines fighting along the Spartan don't make sense, as this book really never uses random Marines helping the Spartans. And the lack of background makes it really hard to tell where they're supposed to be. You would think maybe on a Covenant cruiser, which maybe this is supposed to be when Master Chief is seizing a Covenant cruiser in the early stages of the novel. But the more modern cover is a little better. It keeps the basic pose of the Spartans on front, firing the plasma rifle, using the more updated armor looks from the more recent games. It does cut out the 2 Marines and replaces it with a second Spartan, which makes much more sense based on what's going on in the story. And the background of the book is much clearer, although the downside to that is I still don't know what it's supposed to be. I really don't have any sense of the location where either of these 2 covers take place when I look at them. But overall, not terrible covers. Actually pretty decent. But anyways, let's move on to the synopsis and the world. Now, this isn't my first review of a Halo novel, and as such, if you want a quick description on the world of Halo and, a quick introduction for non-fans of the series, I highly recommend checking out my first video on the subject. There, my friend Holly, who has been in the fandom of Halo much longer than I have, gives a basic synopsis on the Halo world and what she thought new fans needs to know going in. I recommend checking it out. As for the synopsis itself, I read what was on the back of the book in my April TBR video. If you want to see how the book presents itself, or what the book feels you need to know getting into it, I highly recommend watching that video right now. But for the context of this video, the story of the First Strike is that after the events of Halo Combat Evolved, or technically, Halo the Flood. We follow our protagonist, Master Chief Petty Officer John 117, or more widely known as the Master Chief, as he rescues what few survivors from the battle he can. Pilot Pulaski, an ODST named Locklear, an intelligence officer named Haverson, and a fellow Spartan named Linda, as well as the well-known Sergeant Avery Johnson.
Oh, I know what the ladies like.
The group do their best to make it back to UNSC space. In addition, we return to the ground forces of Reach, picking up where we last left them off in the Fall of Reach novel, as Frederick 104, or Fred, leads a majority of the Spartan teams on Reach. However, after a disastrous set of battles, he and his team learn that the Covenant may have bigger interests on Reach beyond simply trying to wipe out humanity. And I think that's about all you really need to know to get into this story. So the real question, what did I think of this book? How did it stack up to its predecessor, The Flood?
You're a fucking disappointment.
Yeah, I normally try not to compare too often lesser books when I compliment good books, but that's honestly the best way I can talk about how good First Strike is, especially as the book itself is more of a direct sequel to the novel rather than Combat Evolved the game. It's actually kind of funny in that regard, because when this book finally cuts back to Master Chief's side of the story, you can almost feel that slight annoyed grimace Eric Nylund is giving the previous entry as he quickly works to retcon everything Dietz messed up. It's like when you have two siblings in the same room and one was told they have to be nice to the other, but the younger sibling is being so much more annoying than they expected that the other one, you can sense that barely constrained annoyance the older sibling has. That look of disgust he wants to give his sibling.
Oh, God.
But I will give the credit that the retcons aren't hastily slapped on one another, a la Disney Star Wars trilogy. No, Nylund does the legwork to explain every retcon, even making an entire subplot focused around the retcon of Sergeant Avery Johnson surviving his encounter with the Flood in the second book. At first, I was genuinely worried that this book was just going to go the route of the author saying, yeah, Johnson wasn't supposed to die, here's a paper-thin excuse why he's still alive, please just accept it so we can move on. In addition, the fight scenes in this book are leagues better than the Flood. I mentioned in my previous review that the Flood felt a lot like a paint-by-the-numbers sort of writing when it came to fight scenes. A lot like the God of War novelization that I read. Most of the story was unfolding like, they go here, bang, bang, dead bad guys. They go there, bang, bang, dead bad guys. Then they go there, bang, bang, dead bad guys. It gets very tedious and annoying really quickly. And it forced me to make myself stay focused, because otherwise I'd drift off while my eyes kept following the words. And I would get half a page through before I realized I did not actually read a single word. So I'd have to go back and reread it to make sure I didn't miss anything. In addition, this book remembers that the Spartans are people first and their military identity second. I mentioned, again in my previous review, that one of the things that kind of annoyed me after reading the amazing Fall of Reach novel was that it was annoying to see Dietz exclusively refer to John 117 entirely by his military identification. As far as Dietz was concerned in the novel, John didn't have an identity outside of being a Spartan. So a lot more legwork is put into this book to remind everyone that the Spartans don't consider themselves a military squad, more or less. They're more like a family. They never call themselves or each other by the military designation, rather their names. There was even an amazingly tiny detail in here that the Spartans have a specific hand motion to show they were happy to see another, tracing a smile along their visors whenever they see another Spartan that they thought was dead. There were more elements like that in this book, ones that would play a bigger part of the narrative, but personally, I love that drawn smile thing. To me, it was a perfect way perfect small way to show that the Spartans were family first and a military squad second. And all characters, some more negative on this than others I brought up, but later on that. But all the characters do feel fully formed. Initially, when we were introduced to the survivors of Reach, I almost thought Nylund was going to fall into the quick trap of making tropes character. He introduces Locklear as the twitchy trigger finger guy who's all meathead, no intelligence. And Havison as a sort of the ends justify the means approach kind of officer. And it makes me think that the book was like very obviously broadcasting that these two people were going to make things a lot harder rather than easier for Master Chief and Johnson as they try to survive. Like, clearly Locklear was either going to panic in a firefight and cause some danger, or he was going to challenge Chief's authority the entire time, and Havison was going to jeopardize the rescue mission of the other Spartans in exchange for something he deemed more important, forcing John to choose between his orders from the lieutenant and his moral duty to his family. And I'm pleased to say that I was mostly wrong about that. These characters are far more than they are initially introduced as. To a degree. Okay, so this is where I'm going to get into the more critical elements of the story. Normally I would include some here in the non-spoiler section, but unfortunately most of the critiques rely on spoiler information to feel more well-formed. As normal, if you want to skip this section to avoid any spoiler information, you want to go into the book without any spoilers, which I do endorse, please go ahead and either stop watching here or skip to the conclusion chapter down below. I'm going to give you all 5 minutes to do as needed. Okay, so one of the big problems that I did have with this book is that after a certain point, if your name wasn't Master Chief or Cortana, the book just kind of didn't care about you anymore. When we're initially introduced to the survivors of Reach, there's a clear dynamic and characterization that just punches right at you, which did lead me to my false conclusions about how Nylund was going to use these characters. But then about the time John makes it back to Reach, everyone just kind of becomes background noise to his character and Cortana's character, even at the expense of the other Spartans. And don't get me wrong, the character art for John is good. He learns that his morality should play a greater role on his decision versus the military doctrine he was trained as. That at times, just because something seems like the best option because that's what the military tells you is the best option, doesn't mean that it actually is. It clearly is playing this up in conjunction with Dr. Halsey, who is in the novel, who does manage to make it into this novel. It's a bit of a spoiler to say that, that's why I waited till here. Playing into her guilt about what she did to the children who would go on to become the Spartans as a good parallel. But again, if you aren't John, the story didn't really care about your character art. Because it was really unfortunate because I felt that the first book had already touched on John learning this lesson. But I expect that Nylund felt he needed to repeat it considering the actions of... This is especially sad because I was genuinely interested in learning more about the other Spartans. Kelly and Fred were primed to be protagonists in a secondary spot alongside the Chief. And it would have been great to learn about the Spartans who survived the initial fall of Reach. Except if your name isn't Kelly, Linda, Fred, or John, you're pretty much just there to be cannon fodder. Which you would think would be relevant because the story also tries to approach Chief's grief at losing so many people he was close to. But we see more genuine grief from Master Chief at the loss of Pulaski, one of the survivors of the fight of Halo, than many of Chief's own self-designated brothers and sisters. And like I said, once he does arrive, the story just kind of stops caring about Kelly and Fred. Hell, when John finally gets into the system, we don't even see how Kelly and Fred fare against the odds that they were at until Chiefs find them. Which is especially egregious because those odds where they were completely surrounded by Covenant forces and trapped in a dead-end passage trying to escape them. You'd expect to see them making some plans of how to survive, circumventing their opponents to send off a signal they're alive, which leaves Chief defining them at the last moment, that sort of thing. But no, he just Oh, well, if I was them, I would have gone there. And so I'm going to go there. Oh, there's a bunch of Covenant there? Yeah, don't worry. We'll get through them.
Permission to leave the station.
For what purpose, Master Chief?
To give the Covenant back their bomb.
I think we also missed out on a great opportunity with Linda. As I mentioned in my previous book review, Linda was technically present at the events of the first game, where she was very technically considered deceased. But Chief had managed to flash freeze her in a cryopod, which protected her from deteriorating any further, allowing her to get proper, extensive medical care in which she was revived. It would have been interesting to see Linda affected by the fact that legally she was dead by 2 weeks, and that the last time she was awake, all of her brothers and sisters were alive, and by the time they woke up, they were down to maybe 7 in total. Maybe this is explored in a different book, as I do think I heard that the following novels, John isn't always the main character. But it is one of those very big missed opportunities. It's, like in Mass Effect, for those of you who are Mass Effect fans as well, in Mass Effect 3, there was a big character arc for Ashley that was cut from the third game, which has her talking to you about the fact that your Shepard had died in the previous works. And she had a big consideration because she's one of the few people that was openly religious in your group, and so she was kind of curious by, like, did you see heaven when you were dead? How did it feel to be dead? And because they cut that big section of her character out, she feels a lot more flat in 3 than she did in the other works. And again, with the various survivors from the Halo installation, apart from Sergeant Avery Johnson, who gets more characterization later, in both the games and the books, I believe.
You told me there wouldn't be any cameras.
And you told me you were gonna wear something nice.
I don't feel any of them were utilized. None of them were characterized properly. I couldn't honestly tell you anything about Pulaski. I could only kind of tell you stuff about Locklear. At a certain point, there was so little characterization that when Locklear was talking to Avery Johnson about his chances with Pulaski, I thought this was supposed to be him being that, like, perverted that perverted soldier who thought anything that was female would sleep with him. But no, later on it's actually revealed, no, they did genuinely like each other, and Locklear wasn't just interested in her because she had boobs, but because he actually had feelings for her. To the point that he finds himself constantly grieving when he's alone, and trying to pull himself out of that. Haverson and Whitcomb, while they do cool stuff, they don't have characterization. Like I said, Haverson's initial characterization came off as a "in justifies the mean," but the second they pick up Whitcomb, it would be very generous to call him even a secondary character to the novel at that point. Apart from that, I think the other biggest sin of the book is that this Forerunner artifact that they find on Reach below the training facility the Spartans were made in just sort of comes off like a Deus Ex Machina a little too often in the book. It does kind of whatever the plot needs it to do at that point in time. For example, you might ask yourself, how did Master Chief manage to make it back to Reach in time to save the survivors from the Covenant? Well, that was because the artifact actually warped space and time to allow Chief to reach them. Okay. How does the group escape several Covenant cruisers trying to blow their captured flagship out of the sky, knowing that because they're using a Covenant ship, the Covenant can literally just go into slip space and charge after them? Well, that's because the artifact actually creates its own little unique pocket of slip space that causes the projectile weaponry to freak out when fired long distances, kind of like ricocheting off of nothing constantly as it flies around, destroying themselves and preventing them from engaging with their enemy, etc., etc. Thus giving our heroes a fighting chance against overwhelming odds. In any case, I think those are the two largest sins of the book. There are a couple minor things I would comment on as well, like reading Sergeant Johnson's introduction and dialogue just sometimes reminds me that this was written in the late 2000s and you get some of that painful 2000s slang. I'm going to read some from 47 because that's the early enough in the book that You know, no spoilers, but the sergeant shrugged. He fished out into his pocket, found the remaining stub of a chewed cigar, and stuck it in the corner of his mouth. Well, I've seen different. They passed me up like I was undercooked spinach at a turkey dinner. At ease, Marine, the sergeant growled. Use that stuff in between your ears for something besides keeping your helmet on. Notice we're floating. Feel those G-forces. The ship is in a slingshot orbit. We're coming around the moon for another crack at the Covenant. Not that it's necessarily bad. It's just a couple of the lines from Johnson just made me groan and laugh at how bad they were. I think at one point he even claims that he's offended they think a bunch of alien sissies can kill him. Like, I'm pretty sure that's exact wording. Alien sissies. All in all, though, I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Obviously, as the first part of my review can tell you, way better than its predecessor. Way better than The Flood. But if you know anything about my history with Dietz, you know that's nothing new. Nylund almost feels like the definitive writer of the Halo novels that I've read so far. I don't think he does very many more past this book, unfortunately. I think the series gets taken over by Greg Bear after this, which those of you who have watched my channel might know that name from Star Wars Rogue Planet. In any case, this is one of those things where it's just like, yeah, honestly, I would highly recommend reading this if you're into the Halo. In fact, I would almost recommend skipping The Flood entirely. That's not a book worth reading. And this book is insular enough that you can skip straight from the first book to this book, and I don't think you'll miss anything. The only thing you might miss is there are a couple references. Like I said, though, those kind of annoying references that Nylund made to Dietz book. But otherwise, it's a good book. And I honestly, as someone who's only played the first game technically, and then most of the third, you can read this without being a really big fan of the games. You can read this without being a big lore expert on the games themselves. And you know what? I can appreciate that. I don't have much else to say in regards to that. This really is a book worth reading, and you know, obviously the question of whether or not it deserves Mount Doom is a big fat no. So, yeah, without further ado, that's really all I gotta say about this book. It's nice to read a decent book once in a while. So, yeah, with that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure. And every adventure is worth having. Even the bad ones. So, everyone.